there. I'm here at the school, and and I'm sure you heard the rooster. And we are going on a tardigrade hunt, a little water bear hunt. Many of you wrote about the tardigrade in your reports in this past week, and so I thought it'd be kind of fun to see if we could find some tardigrades here at the school. So before we start in our search for tardigrades, we've got to know where to look for them. And the two places that we're going to try to find tardigrades today are mosses and lichens. Mosses are, you guys have seen mosses all around. You probably recognize what a moss is, but it's part of a plant family of organisms known as the bryophytes. And lichen, some of you may be familiar with lichens. Lichens are usually found on trees or rocks, growing on trees or rocks. And lichen are actually considered a fungi, even though they work symbiotically with algae. So a lichen really is a fungus. There's a fungus part and there's an algae part to the lichen, but they're classified as fungi. So we don't have to look very far to find moss. Just off the path here before we get started, you can see that there's quite a lot of moss around this tree right here. So I'm going to take a sample of the moss, and I don't need a large sample of this. And you can use a Ziploc bag to put your sample of moss in, or like us, you can just try to recycle a bread bag or bagel bag or whatever you want to store your samples in. So I'm just going to grab a small sample of this. And your sample can be wet or dry, it doesn't matter. Those of you that studied the tardigrade know that they will survive in a variety of conditions. They prefer wet, but they'll survive dry conditions too. So we'll just get a couple of small samples of moss here. And I just put those in the bag. And I've got a Sharpie that I'm going to use to label just the location and the date that I grabbed the moss. So we'll say near Trailhead. And today is the 12th. Okay, so now we're going to go look for another sample. So again, I didn't have to walk very far to find some lichen, but unfortunately the lichen that I've found is a little bit too high for me to reach. But there's two really good examples that cameraman Sam is going to pan over here. You can see the orange lichen in the tree that he's pointing to right now. And then as he pans a little further, there's a pale green lichen growing on another tree there. So we're going to keep looking and try to find some lichen that's a little closer to the ground. Okay, so we found some lichen that's a little bit closer to the ground. And Sam, if you want to just try to get kind of a close-up look at that. It is the pale green variety that we were seeing earlier. So I'm going to pull a sample of this just by picking a little bit of this outer bark layer off. And I'm going to put that in another bag. And again, I don't need a lot. I'm just going to get a few small pieces that I put in the bag there. I'm not sure how well you can see those. And I'm going to label where I found the lichen and the date again. And then I think we're going to look for one more sample before we move on to the next step. Okay, so we have found one more sample of moss. And the reason that I'm taking 3 samples is we just want to increase our chances of finding a tardigrade, hopefully several tardigrades. And so since we already taken a sample of moss from the ground, we're going to take this sample from this tree we found here. And so again, I have my last recycled bag that I'm going to just pick some of this off. Try to anyway, with my hands. And put this inside the bag. You can see there's all kinds of things growing on this tree that is going through that slow decay process. Let's see if I can get one more piece here. Here's a nice piece. So remember, tardigrade are very small, they're less than a millimeter long, and so we don't need a lot of sample to try to find some. So now the next step is we've got to put some water inside of these bags, and we're gonna let these bags sit for 24 hours. And so we're gonna go ahead and head down to the creek. We're very close to the creek right now, and get our water samples and get our lichen and our moss ready to sit for 24 hours. Okay, so now that we have our 3 samples, I've labeled each of these just where I found each sample, whether it was on the ground, on a tree, whether the tree was living or dead. We're going to add just a little bit of water to each bag. Specifically, we want to add 10 milliliters of water to the bags. And if you're in the science lab, we would typically use a graduated cylinder to measure that. But when you're at home, you probably don't have graduated cylinders lying around. So I just thought I'd show you some equivalent measurements here using different tools that you might have around your house. So a lot of people have little medicine cup measuring cups that you could use. This one is actually labeled with 15 and 30 milliliters, but a lot of them have 5 and 10 milliliter measurements on them. And then just in the kitchen, you probably have a tablespoon measuring device lying around as well. So what I want to show you is that when I grab 10 milliliters of water with my graduated cylinder, and I'm using the creek water, which you may or may not have access to a body of surface water at home. And if you don't, I recommend that if you're going to use tap water, that you actually let your tap water sit out for 24 hours without any lid on it, so that some of the chemicals that might be added to the tap water can evaporate or leave or gas out of the water before you add it to your samples, okay? So we want to try to get a fresh sample of water to put in there. So I've got 10 milliliters on there. I don't know if how well you can see that. And again, I'm going to pour that into this little measuring cup here. You can see about how much water that would be in there. And then if I pour that into my tablespoon, it's just not quite a tablespoon. So you don't have to be exact in your measurements, but you want to get about that much water. And I'm going to add this to the bag, and I want to just kind of make sure I get it on each sample. And I'm going to get another 10 milliliters here. And just get close, a little close to that. Doesn't have to be exact, like I said. And again, I want to make sure I get this as close to my sample as I can. And then one more. A little bit more. Okay. And so I've added my 10 milliliters of water to each bag. And what I want to do next is just gently shake the bags to make sure that all the lichen and all the moss get wet. And I probably have more moss than I actually need for this sample. Since I have such a large amount, I'm actually going to add just a little more water to that to make sure that my moss is good and wet. And okay, so just a little gentle shaking for that, and that's mixed pretty good. And then the last one is my lichen that came off of the dead tree, and this looks like it's pretty wet too. So now what we're going to do is we're going to let these bags sit, minimum amount of time is 24 hours, but the maximum time would be several days. And actually, if you can handle, or you can wait for 3 or 4 days, that might be the best, to wait a little bit longer than the 24 hours. And so later this week, we'll tune in again and we'll check to see if we have any tardigrades living on our School.